The story of the British Empire begins not in the halls of Westminster or the courts of kings and queens, but on the decks of ships sailing into uncharted waters. In the late 15th century, Britain was a kingdom still finding its place in the world. It was not yet an empire, but a nation on the edge of something larger, a global network of trade, exploration, and power that would change history forever. In the late 15th century, Europe was in the midst of a period of rapid change. The age of discovery had begun. Across the continent, explorers were setting sail in search of new lands, trade routes, and wealth. The fall of Constantinople in 1493 and the rise of the Ottoman Empire had closed off traditional overland routes to Asia. For European nations, this created a pressing need to find alternative paths to the riches of the East. Spices, silk, and other exotic goods that had driven trade for centuries. This was a time when the world was expanding and the British were eager to join the competition. For Britain, the key figure who would spark the nation's initial efforts in overseas exploration was Henry VII, who ascended to the English throne in 1485. His reign marked the start of a new era in England. Though Henry's primary focus was on securing the throne after years of civil war, his government also encouraged trade and exploration. At this time, England was still emerging from the shadow of the Wars of the Roses, and its maritime ventures were still in their infancy compared to Spain and Portugal, who had already established strong naval empires by this point. The first major English expedition into uncharted waters was led by John Cabot, an Italian explorer working under the patronage of Henry VII. In 1497, Cabot sailed westward from England with the hope of finding a new route to Asia. Instead, he landed on the coast of North America, possibly in Newfoundland, marking the beginning of England's first tentative steps into the New World. Cabot's voyage was significant, not just because it revealed new land to the British, but also because it showed that there were potential riches to be found in these new territories, riches that could one day fuel the empire to come. But while Cabot's voyage is often seen as a milestone, it was not immediately followed by mass exploration. In the years that followed, the Spanish and Portuguese continued to dominate the seas, pushing west to the Americas and east to Africa and Asia. Spain, in particular, became the dominant European power, with explorers like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan claiming vast new territories for the Spanish crown. Meanwhile, England's efforts were still fragmented, limited by financial resources, internal strife, and a lack of strong naval tradition. That began to change during the reign of Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547. Henry's court became a center of Renaissance culture, with art, science, and technology flourishing. His desire to make England a major power on the world stage was clear. Yet, his most direct contribution to the rise of English exploration came through his establishment of the first English Royal Navy. This decision would later pay off, as it allowed England to compete with the maritime powers of Europe. However, it was during the reign of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, that England's ambitions truly began to take shape. Elizabeth, who ruled from 1558 to 1603, became one of the most influential monarchs in English history. While her reign was marked by domestic and religious challenges, particularly the conflict with Catholic Spain, Elizabeth's foreign policy was one of aggressive expansionism, particularly in the Americas. In the late 1500s, Elizabeth sought to establish English dominance over the Atlantic and beyond. As the Spanish Empire continued to expand in the New World, Elizabeth saw an opportunity to challenge Spain's supremacy. The key to this challenge came with the rise of English privateers, men like Sir Francis Drake, who operated as unofficial naval officers, raiding Spanish ships and settlements for their wealth. In 1578, Drake became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, solidifying his place as one of the most famous explorers in English history. Drake's exploits were not just acts of piracy, but part of a broader strategy to expand English influence. His raids on Spanish gold fleets and the capture of Spanish territory in the Americas provided both financial wealth and geopolitical leverage for England. These actions played a pivotal role in laying the groundwork for future English colonization and expansion. With the wealth generated by privateers like Drake, England was able to fund further exploration and establish colonies. Elizabeth also supported the establishment of permanent colonies, the most famous of which was Roanoke, founded in 1585 in what is now North Carolina. While the colony itself was ultimately unsuccessful, Roanoke served as an important learning experience for English colonial ventures. It highlighted both the potential for growth in the Americas and the many challenges that would face any settlers, including hostile indigenous populations, harsh environments, and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across the ocean. It was not until the early 17th century, under the reign of James I, that the first successful English settlement in North America was established. In 1607, the Virginia Company, a joint stock company, founded Jamestown in what is now Virginia. This colony, though beset by difficulties and near failure, would survive and grow, marking the beginning of what would later become the British Empire's extensive colonial holdings in the Americas. In the meantime, English efforts to secure influence in other parts of the world continued. English traders established a foothold in India through the formation of the East India Company in 1608. This company would later become the instrument through which Britain would exert its dominance over the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. The early 17th century also saw English trade ventures reaching Africa, where they began to participate in the transatlantic slave trade, a practice that would become central to the empire's economic success in the coming centuries. The early 17th century marked a critical turning point in the history of British imperial expansion. While English explorers had made notable voyages and established fleeting footholds in the New World, the creation of permanent colonies would be the next crucial step in the nation's colonial journey. One of the most significant events in this era was the founding of Jamestown, the first successful permanent English settlement in North America. This would set the stage for the development of a vast empire spanning multiple continents in the centuries to follow. The story of English colonization begins with the Virginia Company, a joint stock company formed in 1606. This company was tasked with establishing colonies in the New World and finding valuable resources to bring back to England. The Virginia Company's efforts were backed by King James I, who saw the potential for English expansion in the Americas. At the time, Spain and Portugal dominated much of the Western Hemisphere, but England was determined to carve out its own piece of the Americas. In April of 1607, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, set sail from England, carrying a group of over 100 settlers. After a perilous journey across the Atlantic, they arrived on the coast of what is now Virginia and established the Jamestown settlement along the James River. This was the first permanent English colony in North America, and it would face numerous challenges from the start. The settlers of Jamestown faced a range of hardships, including difficult terrain, an unfamiliar climate, and a lack of food. In the early years, many settlers perished from disease, starvation, and conflicts with local Native American tribes. The colony's survival was precarious, and it became clear that a long-term, sustainable system would be needed to make the colony viable. The key to the survival of Jamestown was the discovery of tobacco as a profitable cash crop. In 1609, the Virginia Company sent a new leader, Lord de la Warr, to the colony. Under his leadership, the settlers adopted the cultivation of tobacco as their primary economic activity. Tobacco quickly became the colony's most important export, and its production marked the beginning of a new phase in British colonization. The demand for tobacco in Europe was enormous, and the cultivation of this crop helped to establish the economic foundation of what would later become the American colonies. However, the success of tobacco farming also had significant consequences. The labor required for tobacco cultivation was intense, and the supply of labor soon became one of the colony's most pressing issues. Initially, the colony relied on indentured servants, individuals who agreed to work for a number of years in exchange for passage to the Americas. While indentured servitude was common in the early years, it was not sufficient to meet the growing labor demands of the tobacco economy. By the mid-17th century, the labor force in the English colonies would increasingly rely on enslaved Africans. The first documented arrival of African slaves in Jamestown occurred in 1619, when a Dutch ship brought a group of Africans to the colony. These individuals were sold into slavery, marking the beginning of a brutal system that would become central to the development of the British Empire's economic structure, especially in the Americas. The expansion of tobacco farming in Virginia and other southern colonies like Maryland and the Carolinas would ultimately play a key role in the growth of the British Empire. As the demand for tobacco and other crops like rice and indigo grew, so too did the reliance on enslaved labor. This system of labor would become a cornerstone of the Southern economy, and the British Empire would come to depend on it for much of its wealth. While the Southern colonies were focused on agricultural production, the Northern colonies developed in a different direction. In New England, settlers were largely motivated by religious reasons, and the first permanent English settlement in the region was Plymouth, founded in 1620 by the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, a group of separatists who sought religious freedom, were joined by other settlers, including the Puritans, who would establish a strong presence in the region in the years to come. Unlike the southern colonies where wealth was tied to large-scale farming, New England's economy was based on small farms, trade, and fishing. The region also developed a thriving shipbuilding industry, as its access to the Atlantic Ocean made it an ideal location for maritime commerce. The Puritans, in particular, established a deeply religious society, and their emphasis on hard work and community would shape the cultural identity of New England for generations to come. The early English colonies also faced challenges from the Native American populations they encountered. In many cases, relations between the English settlers and the indigenous peoples were fraught with tension. While some tribes, such as the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, initially sought peaceful relations with the newcomers, others resisted English encroachment on their land. As English settlements grew, so too did conflicts with native populations, leading to violent clashes and wars over territory. One of the most notable conflicts between English settlers and Native Americans was King Philip's War, which took place from 1660 to 1676 in New England. The war, named after the Wampanoag leader Metacom, also known as King Philip, was sparked by the growing tensions between the English settlers and the indigenous tribes. The conflict resulted in heavy casualties on both sides and marked a turning point in the relationship between the English and the Native American populations. By the end of the war, many native tribes had been decimated, and the English settlers had gained further control over the land. In addition to conflicts with Native Americans, the English settlers also faced internal challenges in their colonies. As more settlers arrived in the Americas, competition for land and resources became more intense. This was particularly true in the southern colonies, where the demand for land to grow tobacco led to the displacement of both Native Americans and poor white settlers. Tensions between the wealthy landowners and the lower classes would continue to simmer throughout the colonial period. By the early 17th century, England's growing interest in overseas exploration and colonization revealed a critical need to establish maritime dominance. The seas were the lifeblood of empire, and any nation seeking to expand its influence on the global stage needed a formidable navy. For England, the rise of its naval power would become one of the most crucial factors in its success as a colonial power, shaping the future of the British Empire. At this time, England was not yet the maritime superpower it would later become. The early English Navy had its roots in the reign of Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547. Under Henry, England began to recognize the importance of a strong navy to protect its shores and expand its reach. The construction of larger and more advanced warships became a priority. Henry VIII's ships, such as the Mary Rose, marked a significant leap forward in naval technology. But while Henry's efforts laid the groundwork for a national fleet, it was during the reign of his daughter, Elizabeth I, that the English Navy would undergo a transformation that would elevate Ingdekonen to global prominence. Queen Elizabeth I's reign, 1558 to 1603, was a period of immense significance for England as it sought to expand its influence beyond Europe and into the Americas and beyond. The Spanish Empire, the most powerful European nation at the time, posed a significant threat to English ambitions. Spain's vast empire stretched across the Americas, and its powerful navy dominated the seas. This made Spain both a rival and an obstacle to England's growing colonial aspirations. The defining event of Elizabeth's reign, and one of the most significant naval engagements in history, was the Spanish Armada of 1588. This was an attempted invasion by Spain, which had become increasingly concerned with England's rising power and its support of Protestant rebels in Spain's territories. King Philip II of Spain assembled a massive fleet of over 100 ships with the aim of invading England, overthrowing Elizabeth, and reasserting Catholic dominance. What followed would become a turning point in both the history of the British Empire and naval warfare. Elizabeth's fleet, though smaller and less experienced than the Spanish Armada, was able to outmaneuver and decisively defeat the Spanish. The victory was not only a blow to Spain's imperial ambitions, but also marked the beginning of England's rise as a dominant naval power. The defeat of the Armada demonstrated the importance of maneuverability, faster ships, and superior tactics over sheer numbers. England's victory sent shockwaves throughout Europe, solidifying Elizabeth's position as a powerful leader and signaling the rise of England as a formidable global player. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada, England's naval focus shifted toward asserting its dominance over key trade routes and expanding its colonial holdings. English privateers, such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins, became instrumental in this effort. Privateers were essentially state-sanctioned pirates who targeted Spanish treasure ships and settlements in the Americas, often raiding them for gold, silver, and other valuable goods. These privateers played a crucial role in weakening Spanish control over the New World and boosting England's standing in the global marketplace. Drake, in particular, became a legendary figure in this era. In 1578, he embarked on a journey around the world, becoming the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. Along the way, he plundered Spanish colonies and ships, seizing vast amounts of wealth for England. His exploits not only enriched the English crown, but also demonstrated the potential of maritime power to expand England's influence across the globe. The impact of these maritime victories and the rise of the English Navy was far-reaching. The defeat of the Spanish Armada and the success of English privateers signaled to the rest of Europe that England was a rising naval power. This, in turn, led to the establishment of stronger trade links between England and the New World. As English merchants began to establish more permanent colonies, such as Jamestown, the need for protection and the ability to control trade routes became increasingly important. The Royal Navy would soon play a crucial role in the defense and expansion of the growing British Empire. The development of the English Navy during this period was also a key factor in the broader context of European geopolitics. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, European nations, including France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, were engaged in fierce competition for control of the world's oceans and trade routes. The ability to control these maritime highways was seen as essential to securing both economic and strategic advantages. England, under Elizabeth I, recognized this and began to build a navy that could not only protect its growing empire, but also challenge other European powers. One of the key innovations that allowed England to excel in naval warfare was the development of the galleon, a type of large, powerful ship designed for both war and trade. The English galleon, with its combination of firepower and maneuverability, became the backbone of the Royal Navy. These ships could engage in naval battles while also carrying cargo across the oceans, making them perfect for the dual role of military protection and commerce. In addition to developing powerful warships, England also invested in training and organizing its navy. The Royal Navy became a well-organized institution with a hierarchy and system of command that allowed it to effectively engage in both defensive and offensive operations. By the time of Elizabeth's death in 1603, England had established a solid foundation for its naval power, one that would serve as the foundation for future imperial expansion. As the 17th century unfolded, England's naval power only continued to grow. Under the leadership of figures such as Admiral Robert Blake and later Sir George Monk, the Royal Navy secured England's dominance at sea and helped establish the foundations of the British Empire. Blake, in particular, was instrumental in defeating the Dutch during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of conflicts in the mid-17th century that solidified England's control over key trade routes and colonial possessions. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, fought between England and the Dutch Republic from 1645 to 1654, were pivotal in securing England's position as the dominant naval power. The conflict stemmed from competition over overseas trade and colonial territories, particularly in the Caribbean, North America, and Southeast Asia. The Dutch, who had established a powerful maritime empire of their own, were seen as a threat to English trade and colonial ambitions. The wars resulted in a series of decisive English victories, which allowed England to secure its dominance over important trade routes and commercial hubs. The triumph of the English Navy in these conflicts laid the groundwork for the expansion of the British Empire in the coming centuries. England's naval power allowed it to challenge rival European nations for control of overseas territories, ensuring that England could not only protect its existing colonies but also establish new ones. As the empire grew, the Navy would become the primary instrument for maintaining British control over its vast overseas possessions. In the early 17th century, as England solidified its foothold in the Americas, Europe's global trade routes became increasingly contested. One of the key players in this conflict was the Dutch Republic, a rising maritime power that, by the 1600s, had become one of the most formidable trading nations in the world. As England sought to expand its colonial empire and strengthen its naval capabilities, it found itself locked in a series of conflicts with the Dutch. These confrontations, known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, would not only shape the balance of power in Europe, but also set the stage for Britain's rise as the preeminent global colonial power. The roots of the Anglo-Dutch Wars lay in the intense competition for overseas markets and trade routes. During the 16th and early 17th centuries, the Dutch had established themselves as key players in global commerce. Their innovative maritime technologies, including the use of the flight, a type of cargo ship designed for long-distance trade, allowed them to dominate European trade, particularly in the East Indies and the Americas. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was a powerful commercial entity that controlled the spice trade between Europe and Asia. Similarly, the Dutch West India Company, founded in 1604, focused on the Americas, particularly the sugar trade in the Caribbean and the slave trade to the New World. For England, the rise of Dutch maritime power was a direct challenge. The English were eager to expand their own colonial holdings, particularly in the Caribbean, and to secure access to the lucrative trade routes that the Dutch had long controlled. England also had to contend with the growing Dutch presence in the East Indies, where both nations competed for influence over the highly profitable spice trade. The First Anglo-Dutch War, 1645 and 1654, was largely a struggle for control of global trade. The immediate cause of the war was the Dutch refusal to allow English merchants to trade freely in the East Indies. This tension over trade access escalated into a full-blown military conflict, with England seeking to challenge Dutch naval dominance. Though the war ended in a relatively inconclusive peace, the conflict exposed the underlying tensions between the two nations and foreshadowed the more intense struggles to come. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667, was triggered by the growing competition for colonies and trade routes. In the Caribbean, both nations vied for control of the sugar-rich islands, while in the East Indies, over access to the spice trade. The war was marked by significant naval engagements, including the Battle of Lowestoft in 1665, where the English fleet, commanded by Admiral Sir Robert Blake, defeated the Dutch. However, despite the English victory at sea, the Dutch proved more adept at negotiating peace. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 resulted in an English gain of several Caribbean islands, including Suriname, but allowed the Dutch to retain control of key territories in Asia. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, 1672 to 1674, was the most intense of the three. This conflict was sparked by England's desire to curb Dutch influence and assert its dominance over key maritime trade routes. The war was also influenced by broader European political dynamics, with England and France forming an alliance against the Dutch, who were engaged in a larger struggle with France. The battle was fought not only in the Caribbean and the Americas, but also in Europe's coastal waters, where naval superiority was critical. The war ended with another inconclusive peace settlement, but the English were able to establish their dominance over certain territories, particularly in the Americas. Despite the relative inconclusiveness of these wars, the Anglo-Dutch conflicts played a significant role in the development of the British Empire. The wars had two primary outcomes. First, they demonstrated the importance of naval power in securing colonial territories and trade routes. Second, they exposed the limits of Dutch power in the face of growing English naval might. By the end of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, England had gained substantial territorial holdings in the Caribbean, which would become crucial to its growing empire. The acquisition of islands like Jamaica in 1665 after the Second Anglo-Dutch War was a major step toward the British domination of the sugar trade in the Caribbean. The English also solidified their presence in North America, where the ongoing struggle for control of colonies such as New York, formerly a Dutch colony, marked another victory for English imperial ambitions. These victories were not just about acquiring land, they were about securing economic power. The sugar trade, in particular, would become the backbone of the British colonial economy in the Caribbean. English sugar plantations, worked by enslaved Africans, generated enormous wealth. By the late 17th century, sugar had become one of the most valuable commodities in the world. The wealth generated by the sugar trade, along with other cash crops, such as tobacco, would fuel the expansion of the British Empire in the Americas. The Dutch, meanwhile, were not completely displaced by English victories in the Caribbean. While the Dutch were pushed out of many territories, they maintained a strong presence in the East Indies, where their control of the spice trade remained a significant source of wealth. However, English interest in the region was growing, and the establishment of the English East India Company in 1608 would soon challenge Dutch dominance in Asia. The company would go on to play a key role in the expansion of British influence in India and Southeast Asia, and the rivalry between the two maritime powers would continue to shape British imperial strategy. In the mid-18th century, the British Empire was on the verge of a major transformation. The global landscape was shifting, and competition between European powers was intensifying. The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, would become one of the most pivotal conflicts in shaping the future of the British Empire. Known as the First World War, it spanned continents, involving most of the great powers of Europe and their colonial possessions in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The outcome of the war would not only determine the balance of power in Europe, but also dramatically expand British territorial holdings across the globe. The roots of the 7 Years' War can be traced to the long-standing rivalry between Britain and France. These two nations had been engaged in a series of conflicts for centuries, each seeking to expand their influence and control over global trade routes and colonial territories. By the mid-18th century, both Britain and France had established vast colonial empires, with Britain controlling large parts of North America and India, and France holding territories in Canada and the West Indies, as well as in parts of India. The immediate cause of the 7 Years' War was a dispute over territorial claims in North America. Both Britain and France sought control of the Ohio River Valley, a region rich in resources and strategically important for trade. Tensions in the American colonies had been escalating for years, and by 1754, open hostilities broke out between British and French forces. As the war in North America, known as the French and Indian War, intensified, it quickly spread to other parts of the world, including Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. The British government, under King George II and later King George III, recognized that defeating France was essential not only to securing its colonial holdings, but also to consolidating its growing maritime power. To achieve this, Britain formed an alliance with Prussia, a rising European power, while France allied with Austria, Russia, and Spain. The war was marked by a series of complex military engagements on both the European continent and across the colonies, with the British Navy playing a central role in securing victory for Britain. One of the most important aspects of the British strategy during the 7 Years' War was its naval superiority. The British Royal Navy, having already defeated the Spanish Armada and dominated European waters for over a century, was crucial to securing British victories. The Navy not only provided logistical support for British forces fighting on land, but also engaged the French Navy in key naval battles, such as the Battle of Quiberon Bay in 1759, where the British decisively defeated the French fleet. This victory effectively neutralized French naval power and ensured British control of the seas, allowing Britain to maintain its colonial supply lines and protect its overseas territories. The British Army, under the leadership of commanders such as General James Wolfe, also played a critical role in the conflict. In North America, British forces faced off against French troops and their Native American allies in a series of bloody battles. The most famous of these was the Battle of Quebec in 1759, a turning point in the war. General Wolfe's victory in Quebec led to the eventual British capture of New France, modern-day Canada, a significant territorial gain that would reshape the future of North America. The British were also successful in India, where they were engaged in a separate conflict known as the Third Carnatic War. In India, the British East India Company, which had been operating in the region since the early 17th century, found itself in competition with the French East India Company for control of trade and territory. British forces, led by Robert Clive, secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This victory effectively gave the British control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in India, and laid the foundation for the British Raj, the period of British rule in India that would last until the mid-20th century. In the Caribbean, the British also made significant territorial gains during the war. The British captured several French islands in the West Indies, including Guadeloupe and Martinique, which were valuable sources of sugar and other colonial goods. These islands would become integral to the British colonial economy, particularly in the sugar trade, which relied heavily on enslaved labor. By the end of the war in 1763, Britain had emerged as the undisputed global superpower. The Treaty of Paris, signed in that year, marked the official conclusion of the 7 Years' War. The treaty had profound consequences for the colonial world. Britain gained control of Canada and all French territories east of the Mississippi River, including Florida from Spain. The British also secured their dominance in India, where they would gradually expand their influence over the next century. In the Caribbean, Britain's control over valuable sugar-producing islands was solidified. France, on the other hand, was forced to cede significant portions of its colonial empire to Britain, significantly weakening its global position. The 7 Years' War had left Britain with an empire that spanned the globe, from Canada to India, from the Caribbean to Africa. The British Empire was a formidable presence. Yet, by the late 18th century, despite its military triumphs, Britain nowadays found some found itself on the brink of losing its most important and profitable colonies, those in North America. The American Revolution, which began in 1775 and ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, would dramatically reshape the British Empire and set in motion a new era of imperial strategy. The origins of the American Revolution lie in the growing discontent among the American colonists with British rule. The 7 Years' War had left Britain deeply in debt, and the British government sought to recoup its expenses by imposing taxes on the American colonies. The colonists, who had long enjoyed a degree of self-governance, saw these taxes as an infringement on their rights and began to resist. The Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed paper goods and legal documents, was one of the first direct taxes imposed by Britain on the colonies. It was met with widespread protests and the formation of the Stamp Act Congress, where representatives from several colonies gathered to organize a response. Though the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, the British government continued to impose other taxes, such as the Townshend Acts, which taxed goods like glass, tea, and paper. By the early 1770s, tensions between Britain and its American colonies had reached a boiling point. The colonies were angered not only by the taxes, but also by the presence of British troops stationed in America to enforce British policies. The infamous Boston Massacre of 1770, in which British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a protest, further fueled anti-British sentiment. As the British government continued to assert its control, colonial resistance grew stronger, culminating in the events of December of 1773, when American colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped an entire shipment of tea into the water. This act of defiance, known as the Boston Tea Party, led to even harsher measures from Britain, including the Coercive Acts, which were designed to punish Massachusetts and bring it into line. In response to these actions, the 13 American colonies united in their opposition to British rule. The First Continental Congress convened in 1774 to discuss their grievances and coordinate a response. By the time the Second Continental Congress met in 1775, the situation had escalated to armed conflict. The Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of that year marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. At the outset of the war, the British were confident that they could quickly suppress the rebellion. After all, the colonies were still heavily dependent on Britain for trade, military protection, and supplies. But the Americans had several advantages of their own. They were fighting on familiar ground, and their cause was fueled by a strong sense of independence and the desire for self-determination. Furthermore, they were able to secure crucial support from foreign powers, particularly France, which provided military and financial aid to the American cause. One of the key turning points in the war was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. The American victory at Saratoga convinced the French to enter the war on the side of the Americans. The French saw an opportunity to weaken their old rival, Britain, and provide support to the American colonies. The French provided essential military support, including troops, naval power, and funding, which greatly increased the Americans' chances of victory. The British, meanwhile, faced numerous challenges. While they had superior military strength, they struggled with long supply lines, a lack of support among the American population, and the difficulty of maintaining control over vast and distant territories. The British military also had to contend with the growing resistance of local militias and the inability to decisively crush the American forces in the field. The war became a long and costly struggle for Britain, both in terms of finances and manpower. In the South, the British had some initial successes, taking key cities like Savannah and Charleston. However, the American forces, led by commanders like Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion, waged a successful guerrilla campaign that wore down the British. The turning point in the Southern Campaign came in 1781, when General Cornwallis, the British commander, was trapped at Yorktown by American and French forces. The French fleet cut off British escape by sea, while American and French forces, under the command of General George Washington and the French General Rochambeau, laid siege to the British position on land. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, effectively ending the war in the American colonies. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally ended the American Revolutionary War. The treaty recognized the independence of the United States and established new boundaries for the fledgling nation. Britain ceded control of the territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, including all lands south of the Great Lakes. The loss of these vast territories was a severe blow to British imperial ambitions in North America. For Britain, the loss of the American colonies marked a major turning point in its imperial history. The colonies had been Britain's most valuable possessions, providing significant economic resources, including tobacco, sugar, and timber, as Matselvo, as Sanjaski, as was have an important market for British goods. The American Revolution highlighted the limits of British power and the difficulties of controlling distant territories. It also forced Britain to reconsider its approach to empire building, leading to a shift in focus toward its remaining colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The 18th century was a time of enormous change for Britain. While its empire had seen considerable growth and expansion, the loss of the American colonies in 1783 had prompted a shift in British imperial strategy. Yet, it was during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, that Britain would truly begin to redefine its global power. The revolution brought profound economic, social, and technological changes that transformed not only Britain, but the entire world. This period marked the emergence of a new phase of imperial expansion, one fueled by industrialization and technological innovation. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, was the result of a series of interconnected developments. Key among these was the rise of new manufacturing techniques and the use of machinery to produce goods on a larger scale than ever before. The invention of the steam engine by James Watt in 1776 was one of the most important breakthroughs, as it enabled machines to run more efficiently and powered the rapid development of industries such as textiles, iron, and coal mining. With these new technologies, Britain was able to mass-produce goods, increase productivity, and drive economic growth like never before. The transformation of Britain's economy had direct implications for its imperial ambitions. The country's newfound industrial strength required access to raw materials such as cotton, rubber, and metals, which could be sourced from its vast colonial empire. The demand for these materials, along with the need for new markets to sell British-made goods, drove further expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. British merchants and industrialists saw new opportunities to exploit resources and establish profitable trade routes. One of the key factors in the success of the Industrial Revolution was the development of new transportation systems. The invention of the steam-powered locomotive and the expansion of railroads made it possible to move goods more quickly and efficiently within Britain. But the impact of these developments was felt even more profoundly in the empire. Steamships made transatlantic travel faster and more reliable, helping to connect Britain with its colonies across the globe. The ability to move goods and people more efficiently allowed Britain to control distant parts of the empire with greater ease, reinforcing its dominance in global trade. Britain's industrialization also coincided with a shift in its imperial policies. In the wake of the American Revolution, Britain sought new territories to fuel its growing economy. While its former American colonies had been a major source of wealth, the loss of the colonies had forced Britain to look elsewhere for new opportunities. The first major area of focus was India. The British East India Company, which had been active in India since the early 17th century, played a central role in this shift. The company's increasing involvement in Indian affairs paved the way for British direct control of the subcontinent. In the early 19th century, the British East India Company began to expand its control over Indian territory, often through military force. The company's role in India became more significant after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when Robert Clive led British forces to a decisive victory over the forces of the Nawab of Bengal. This victory marked the beginning of British political and economic control in India, though it would take decades before the entire subcontinent was fully under British rule. The Industrial Revolution played a pivotal role in Britain's ability to expand its influence in India. The production of textiles was a key driver of this expansion. British factories were able to produce vast quantities of cheap, mass-produced textiles, which flooded global markets and undermined traditional industries in places like India. As a result, India became an important supplier of raw materials, such as cotton, which were then processed in British factories. At the same time, British industrial goods, including textiles, were sold in Indian markets, further consolidating Britain's economic control over the region. Britain's industrial power also enabled it to expand its influence in Africa. The desire for raw materials such as rubber, gold, and diamonds drove British interest in the African continent. The Industrial Revolution made it easier for Britain to extract these resources, and the development of steamships and railways allowed for more efficient transport of goods from the interior of Africa to coastal ports. By the mid-19th century, Britain had established a colonial presence in parts of Africa, including Egypt, South Africa, and parts of West Africa. The development of the Suez Canal in Egypt in the 1850s was a significant turning point in Britain's imperial ambitions. The canal, which connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, drastically shortened the shipping route between Europe and Asia. The British quickly recognized the strategic importance of the Suez Canal, and by the late 19th century, Britain had established control over Egypt. The Suez Canal would become a vital link in Britain's global empire, enabling faster movement of goods and military forces between Britain and its colonies in Asia and Africa. While Britain's empire continued to expand in Africa and Asia, it was also looking to new territories in the Pacific. The rise of steam-powered ships made it easier for Britain to establish and maintain colonies in the Pacific, particularly in places like Australia and New Zealand. In the early 19th century, Britain had already established penal colonies in Australia, and by the mid-19th century, the country began to expand its control over New Zealand. The Pacific region became an important part of Britain's imperial strategy, with British control over key ports and trade routes facilitating the movement of goods and people throughout the empire. The Industrial Revolution also had significant social and political consequences in Britain itself. The rapid pace of industrialization led to urbanization, with millions of people moving from rural areas to cities in search of work. This shift in population created new social challenges, including overcrowding, poor living conditions, and the exploitation of workers, particularly women and children, in factories. The harsh realities of industrial life led to social reforms and the eventual rise of labor movements, which demanded better working conditions, higher wages, and the right to organize. The late 19th century marked a dramatic shift in the global balance of power, with European nations, led by Britain, turning their attention to Africa. The scramble for Africa, as it came to be known, was driven by a combination of economic, strategic, and imperial motivations. As industrialization continued to revolutionize European economies, the need for raw materials and new markets increased. In addition, technological advancements in transportation and weaponry made it easier for European powers to extend their influence over distant lands. For Britain, Africa became a crucial part of its imperial ambitions as it sought to expand its holdings on the continent and secure control over vital trade routes. While European interest in Africa had existed for centuries, it was during the latter half of the 19th century that the continent became a focal point for imperial expansion. Prior to this period, Africa was primarily seen by Europeans as a source of slaves, ivory, and gold, with European powers establishing trading posts along the coast. However, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of European capitalism altered the dynamics of African colonization. European nations, in their quest for new markets and resources, sought to claim vast territories on the African continent, often with little regard for the indigenous peoples who had lived there for centuries. Britain was at the forefront of this imperial rush into Africa. As the world's leading industrial power, Britain needed access to a vast array of raw materials, including rubber, cotton, gold, and diamonds, all of which were abundant in Africa. In addition, Britain sought to maintain its dominance in global trade by securing key strategic locations that would facilitate the movement of goods and protect its maritime routes. Control of Africa's interior, particularly in regions like East Africa and Central Africa, would give Britain greater influence over the movement of goods from India and the Middle East, as well as provide new opportunities for agricultural expansion. The process of colonizing Africa began in earnest in the 1880s, when European powers started to establish formal claims over African territories. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a pivotal moment in the scramble for Africa. The conference, convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, was a diplomatic meeting between European powers to establish the rules for colonizing Africa. Although no African representatives were present, the conference laid the groundwork for the division of the continent among European nations. The principle established at the conference was that any European power could lay claim to African territory as long as it could effectively control it. The result of the Berlin Conference was a rapid increase in European colonial activity in Africa. By the end of the 19th century, nearly all of Africa had been divided among European powers, with Britain gaining control of vast regions. Britain's imperial holdings included Egypt, which it had occupied since 1854, and later extended to Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Nigeria. British control of Egypt in particular was strategically important due to the Suez Canal, which had been completed in 1859 and connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, facilitating faster trade routes between Europe and Asia. The British Empire also sought to expand its influence in southern Africa. In the 1880s, Britain became involved in the ongoing conflict between European settlers and indigenous populations in South Africa. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the region in the late 19th century further fueled British interest in the area. In 1899, Britain fought the Boer War, also known as the Second Anglo-Boer War, against the Dutch-descended Boers, Afrikaners, who controlled independent republics in the region. The war ended in 1802 with British victory, and South Africa was formally incorporated into the British Empire. This marked the beginning of British control over the entire southern tip of the African continent. The scramble for Africa was not limited to British expansion. Other European powers, including France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy, also established colonies on the continent. France, for example, had a significant colonial presence in West Africa, while Belgium, under King Leopold II, gained control of the Congo Free State, a vast region in Central Africa that was brutally exploited for its rubber and ivory resources. Germany, though a latecomer to the colonial race, established colonies in East Africa, Southwest Africa, and the Cameroons. The competition for African territories led to a series of military conflicts and diplomatic tensions between European powers. One of the most notable of these was the Fashoda Crisis of 1898, when British and French forces nearly came to blows over control of Sudan. The crisis was resolved diplomatically, with both sides agreeing to recognize each other's colonial holdings, but it highlighted the intense rivalry between the European powers. While the scramble for Africa was largely driven by European powers, the effects on African societies were profound. The European colonization of Africa disrupted indigenous political structures, economies, and cultures. Traditional systems of governance were replaced with European colonial administrations, and African populations were subjected to forced labor, land dispossession, and the imposition of foreign laws and taxes. The European powers also introduced new economic systems based on cash crops, mining, and resource extraction, which often benefited the colonizers while leaving African communities impoverished. Resistance to European rule was widespread across the continent. In many cases, African leaders and communities fought back against colonial encroachment, leading to a series of rebellions and wars. In South Africa, the Zulu kingdom resisted British attempts to extend control over their territory in the late 19th century, culminating in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. In East Africa, the Mahdist forces in Sudan fought against British and Egyptian rule during the Mahdist War, which lasted from 1881 to 1898. However, despite these efforts, the superior military technology and organizational strength of the European powers ultimately led to the consolidation of their control over most of Africa. The exploitation of Africa's resources and labor was a central feature of European colonial rule. The extraction of raw materials such as rubber, gold, diamonds, and timber fueled the growth of European industries, particularly in Britain. In addition, African labor was used to build infrastructure such as railroads and ports, which facilitated the transport of goods to European markets. The economic benefits of colonialism were heavily skewed in favor of the European powers, and the wealth extracted from Africa played a crucial role in funding the expansion of European imperialism worldwide. The mid-19th century marked a period of profound change for the British Empire, particularly in its most valuable colony, India. India had long been central to British imperial ambitions. By the 18th century, the British East India Company had gradually expanded its influence over much of the subcontinent, managing its territories and resources. However, the relationship between Britain and India was complex, marked by both economic dependency and simmering resentment. The British presence in India was built on a combination of military power, economic exploitation, and political maneuvering, but it was fragile. In 1857, this fragility was exposed in what would become known as the Indian Rebellion, or the Sepoy Mutiny, a pivotal event in the history of British India. The origins of the rebellion can be traced to a variety of factors, all of which combined to create a volatile situation. The British East India Company had taken control of much of India by the early 19th century, but it did so with policies that often alienated both the native aristocracy and the common people. Economic exploitation was rampant, with the British demanding large amounts of tribute and taxes from the Indian populace. The British also controlled large parts of the Indian economy, particularly through the production of raw materials like cotton, which were shipped to Britain and turned into finished goods. The Industrial Revolution in Britain created an insatiable demand for these raw materials, but the local Indian economy was often left impoverished as a result. Furthermore, the British presence in India was underpinned by a military apparatus largely made up of Indian soldiers known as sepoys, who were employed by the British East India Company. The sepoys were recruited from various regions of India and were a significant part of the company's military forces. While the British used Indian soldiers to maintain order and expand their empire, there was a growing sense of resentment among the sepoys about their treatment by the British. They were subjected to harsh discipline, low wages, and a lack of respect for their cultural practices. The immediate cause of the rebellion was the introduction of the new Enfield rifle by the British East India Company in 1857. The rifle was designed to use cartridges that had to be bitten open before loading. Rumors spread among the sepoys that these cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat, which offended both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The cow is sacred to Hindus, while Muslims are forbidden from consuming pork. This perceived affront to their religious beliefs was the spark that ignited the rebellion. The discontent among the sepoys soon spread beyond the military to the wider population. The Indian elite, who had previously been in conflict with the British over issues of land and political influence, began to join in the revolt. The rebellion began in Meerut on May 10, 1857, when a group of sepoys mutinied, killing British officers and civilians. The rebellion spread quickly across northern and central India, with major uprisings in Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi. Rebel leaders, including the famous Rani of Jhansi and local Indian rulers, fought back against the British with varying degrees of success. For the British, the rebellion was a shock. The scale and intensity of the revolt caught them off guard, and it took many months to fully suppress the uprising. The British responded with overwhelming military force, using both British and loyal Indian forces to crush the rebellion. The recapture of Delhi in September of 1857 was a major turning point in the conflict, as the city had become the symbolic heart of the rebellion. Over the following months, British forces systematically retook rebel-held areas, and by the end of the year, the rebellion had largely been put down. Despite the British victory, the rebellion had far-reaching consequences. It exposed the deep resentment felt by many Indians towards British rule, and it fundamentally altered the relationship between Britain and its most important colony. One of the most significant outcomes of the rebellion was the end of the British East India Company's rule over India. In 1858, the British government formally took control of India, and the country became a British Crown colony. The British Raj, as this period of direct British rule was known, would last until India's independence in 1947. The British Raj represented a significant shift in the way India was governed. The British government established a centralized administration and a direct system of control, in contrast to the earlier system of indirect rule through the East India Company. British officials were appointed to key positions of power in India, and the British Army was used to maintain order. The economic policies that had been implemented under the East India Company, such as heavy taxation and the extraction of raw materials, were intensified. The British also introduced infrastructure projects such as railways, roads, and telegraph lines to further integrate India into the global economy and facilitate the movement of goods and troops. The rebellion of 1857 also led to a shift in British attitudes toward India and its people. The British, who had previously seen India as a source of wealth and labor, began to view the country with increasing suspicion. The British Raj was marked by a heightened sense of control and surveillance as the British sought to prevent further unrest. British policies became more repressive, with heavy censorship and restrictions on Indian political activity. At the same time, the British attempted to civilize India through a variety of social and educational reforms. However, many of these reforms were met with resistance, as they were seen as foreign impositions on Indian culture and tradition. The early 20th century saw the British Empire reach its zenith in terms of territorial expanse and global influence. At the height of its power, Britain controlled vast swathes of land across every inhabited continent. However, despite its dominance, the British Empire would soon face the greatest challenge in its history, the First World War. This catastrophic conflict, which raged from 1914 to 1918, would have profound consequences for the British Empire, affecting both its military power and the political structure that held it together. The roots of the First World War lay in the rising tensions between European powers, driven by a combination of nationalism, militarism, and imperial competition. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia were all vying for global dominance, with colonial holdings and military might often at the center of their rivalries. The conflict began in August of 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, and quickly escalated into a global war. Within weeks, Britain declared war on Germany, marking the beginning of its involvement in a conflict that would reshape the global order. The British Empire, with its vast colonial holdings, was deeply intertwined with the war effort. Britain's strategy was to leverage its imperial resources, drawing on the manpower, raw materials, and financial resources of its colonies. Millions of soldiers from across the empire, India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, fought alongside British troops on the battlefields of Europe. The war was truly global in scope, with battles fought not only in Europe but also in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The British Empire's military was now a vast, multinational force, and the war effort relied heavily on this global network. One of the most significant aspects of the British war effort was the role played by soldiers from India. India, which had been under British control for nearly a century by the time of the war, contributed enormously to the British military effort. Approximately 1 million Indian soldiers and laborers served in various capacities fighting on the Western Front, in the Middle East, and in Africa. Indian troops participated in major battles, including those at Neuve Chapelle, Ypres, and the Somme, where they served alongside British and other colonial forces. Indian soldiers were also crucial in campaigns in East Africa, where they fought against German forces in the colonies of modern-day Tanzania and Rwanda. The contribution of Indian soldiers to the British war effort was not limited to military engagement. The British government also relied on India for crucial supplies of food, materials, and money to support the war effort. Indian farmers provided vast amounts of wheat and other essential crops to feed British soldiers and civilians. The British government also raised significant funds through loans and taxation from India, a practice that left many Indians resentful after the war, as they had not been given a say in how the funds were used. Despite their significant contributions, the Indian soldiers and their families were often treated with disdain by the British. Many Indians were frustrated by the lack of recognition for their sacrifices, especially given that they had fought for a country that denied them basic rights and freedoms. This feeling of disenfranchisement was exacerbated by the post-war period, when British leaders failed to deliver on promises of political reforms in exchange for the support of Indian soldiers and workers. The failure to recognize the contributions of India would be one of the driving forces behind the rise of Indian nationalism in the years following the war. Another key contribution from Britain's empire came from its dominions, particularly Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These countries, though not yet fully independent, had developed strong national identities and were eager to demonstrate their loyalty to Britain. Canadian forces, for example, played a significant role in the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917, a pivotal victory for the Allies that helped solidify Canada's reputation as a powerful and independent nation. The participation of Australian and New Zealand troops, particularly in campaigns in Gallipoli and the Middle East, helped to build a sense of national pride in those countries as well. The war, in many ways, helped to strengthen the ties between Britain and its dominions, but it also set the stage for the eventual push for full independence in the post-war period. The war also had significant repercussions for the British economy. The costs of fighting a global conflict were staggering, and Britain's resources were severely strained. The war effort placed enormous pressure on British industries as factories shifted to producing war materials and food and supplies became increasingly scarce. To finance the war, Britain borrowed heavily, both from other nations and from its own colonies, including India. The result was a massive increase in national debt, and by the end of the war, Britain's financial stability had been severely compromised. The economic consequences of the First World War were felt not just in Britain, but throughout the British Empire. Many colonial economies were disrupted by the demands of the war. For example, agricultural production in India and Africa was diverted to supply the needs of the military, leading to shortages of essential goods for local populations. The war also severely disrupted trade routes, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, where many regions had previously depended on the movement of goods between Britain's colonies. The war left many parts of the empire economically dependent on Britain, further deepening the imperial relationship, but also exacerbating the inequalities that existed within the empire. The human cost of the First World War was staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives in the conflict, and the British Empire was no exception. The death toll among British and colonial forces was immense, with over 700,000 British soldiers killed and hundreds of thousands more wounded. The deaths of so many young men left a deep mark on British society, as entire communities were left grieving their losses. The war also created a generation of soldiers who returned home physically and mentally scarred. Many veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, facing poor treatment and a lack of support from the government. The aftermath of the war also had profound political implications for the British Empire. While Britain emerged victorious, it did so at great cost. The war had exposed the vulnerabilities of the empire, particularly the difficulties of managing a vast global network during a time of crisis. In the years following the war, Britain's imperial power began to erode. The economic strain caused by the war, coupled with growing nationalist movements in the colonies, made it increasingly difficult for Britain to maintain control over its empire. The end of the First World War in 1918 was a momentous event in the history of the British Empire. Though victorious, Britain emerged from the war economically weakened and politically fragmented. The cost of the war, both in terms of human lives and financial resources, had been staggering. With a mounting national debt, a disrupted economy, and a shifting global order, Britain found itself at a crossroads. The empire, which had been at its height in the late 19th century, was now beginning to show signs of strain. The interwar period, spanning from 1919 to 1939, marked a time of dramatic change for the British Empire, as it struggled to maintain control over its vast territories while dealing with the growing demand for self-determination from its colonies. One of the most significant factors in the decline of British imperial power during the interwar period was the economic impact of the First World War. The war had drained Britain's resources, leading to an enormous increase in national debt. The British government was forced to borrow extensively from the United States and other countries to finance the war effort. This left Britain with a heavy financial burden that would take decades to repay. At the same time, Britain's industries had been focused on war production, and many sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing and trade, struggled to return to peacetime conditions. The global economy was also hit hard by the war, and the subsequent Great Depression of the early 1930s further exacerbated Britain's economic difficulties. The economic strain of the interwar period had far-reaching consequences for Britain's imperial policies. With a weakened economy, Britain could no longer afford the same level of investment in its colonies. The cost of maintaining and governing far-flung territories became increasingly difficult to justify, especially as nationalist movements in the colonies began to grow stronger. Many of Britain's colonial subjects had made significant contributions. And in return, they expected greater political autonomy and a say in their governance. However, Britain's response was often one of resistance and repression, as the British government sought to maintain control over its empire. In India, the aftermath of the First World War was marked by increasing unrest. The Indian independence movement, which had been gaining momentum for several decades, was reinvigorated by the economic hardships brought about by the war. The British had promised reforms to India in exchange for support during the war, but they had failed to deliver meaningful political change. The government's decision to introduce repressive measures, such as the Rowlatt Act of 1917, which allowed for the detention of Indians without trial, further fueled discontent. In response to the Rowlatt Act, protests erupted across India, and many were violently suppressed by the British authorities, including the infamous massacre at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar in 1919, in which British troops killed hundreds of unarmed Indian civilians. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre was a turning point in the Indian independence movement. It galvanized widespread opposition to British rule, and the incident was widely condemned both in India and abroad. The outrage over the massacre led to the rise of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of the Indian independence movement. Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience became the cornerstone of the struggle for Indian independence. Under his leadership, Millions of Indians participated in peaceful protests and boycotts of British goods, demanding greater political rights and self-determination. While the situation in India was deteriorating, British colonial rule was also under pressure in other parts of the empire. In Egypt, British control over the Suez Canal had been a key strategic interest since the 19th century. But nationalist movements in Egypt were gaining momentum. The Egyptian Revolution of 1921, though ultimately unsuccessful in securing full independence, highlighted the growing discontent with British rule. In response to the pressure, Britain granted Egypt nominal independence in 1922, though it retained control over the Suez Canal and continued to exert influence over the country's political and military affairs. In Ireland, the quest for independence had reached a boiling point. Following years of political unrest and the devastating impact of the First World War, the Irish War of Independence began in 1918, leading to the eventual partition of Ireland. In 1920, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, granting the southern part of Ireland independence as the Irish Free State. However, the partition of Ireland created deep divisions, with Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. The Irish question continued to be a source of tension in British politics, and the legacy of the conflict would persist throughout the 20th century. The political and economic difficulties of the interwar period were compounded by the rise of new political ideologies, particularly in Europe. The emergence of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany posed a direct challenge to Britain's position as a global power. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany in particular was seen as a direct threat to the stability of Europe and the British Empire. As tensions in Europe escalated during the late 1930s, Britain began to re-evaluate its imperial priorities. The need to defend Europe from external threats took precedence over maintaining control over distant colonies, and Britain found itself increasingly unable to juggle both. Despite the economic and political challenges of the interwar period, Britain continued to hold on to its empire, though its grip was weakening. The British government did take some steps to address the growing demands for reform in the colonies, though these reforms were often seen as insufficient. In India, for example, the Government of India Act of 1935 granted limited self-governance, but the Indian independence movement rejected the measure, demanding full independence. Gandhi and other leaders of the independence movement continued their campaigns of civil disobedience, and the pressure on Britain to grant India independence grew. The interwar period was also marked by the increasing importance of the United States as a global power. The United States, which had entered the First World War late but had emerged as a dominant economic and military power, began to challenge Britain's position in the world. The United States' refusal to join the League of Nations after the war and its growing economic influence signaled a shift in the global balance of power. Britain, once the world's preeminent imperial power, now found itself facing increasing competition from other rising powers, particularly the United States and Japan. The Second World War, which began in 1939, marked a turning point not only for Europe but for the entire world. For Britain, the war would prove to be both a struggle for survival and a catalyst for the eventual collapse of the British Empire. While Britain fought valiantly against Nazi Germany, the war also exposed the cracks in its imperial foundation. The immense financial costs of the war, combined with the rise of independence movements in colonies, would fundamentally alter the British Empire. By the end of the war in 1945, the world had changed irrevocably, and the British Empire would begin to unravel in a way that no one could have anticipated just a few years earlier. When Britain declared war on Germany in September of 1939, it was entering a conflict that would test its military strength, economic stability, and political resolve. The war rapidly escalated across Europe. But the global reach of the conflict soon brought Britain's vast empire into play. The British colonies and dominions, including India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, automatically found themselves aligned with Britain's cause, as they enhadunder dado nas anu tundur. During the First World War, The British Empire was thus once again thrust into a global struggle, but this time the stakes were far higher. The military demands of the war were overwhelming. Britain faced a constant threat from Nazi Germany in Europe, while Japan's imperial expansion in the East placed immense strain on British possessions in Asia and the Pacific. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over England during the summer and autumn of 1940, was one of the most critical moments in Britain's fight for survival. The Royal Air Force, RAF, with its tireless efforts, repelled the Luftwaffe and prevented a German invasion of Britain. However, the cost of this victory was immense, as the British economy was stretched to its limits. As the war raged on, Britain found itself borrowing heavily from the United States to finance its war efforts. The financial strain of the war was compounded by the toll it took on the British workforce. With so many men serving in the armed forces, the British economy relied heavily on women and colonial labor to fill gaps in factories, agriculture, and other essential industries. Indian, African, and Caribbean workers were recruited to support the British war effort, and many fought alongside British troops in campaigns in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The contributions of Britain's colonies during the war, however, would not go unnoticed. Across the empire, the idea of self-determination began to take root, as many colonial subjects felt they had earned a right to the same freedoms for which Britain was fighting. Despite these contributions, Britain's political leadership was slow to address the demands for greater autonomy from its colonies. For example, the Indian independence movement, which had been simmering for decades, gained further momentum during the war. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had been calling for self-rule for years, but British leaders continued to delay meaningful reforms. The British response to Indian demands during the war was to promise future constitutional reforms, but it was too little too late. The nationalist sentiment among Indians grew stronger, and the British could not ignore the increasing calls for independence. Meanwhile, in Africa, the war had a profound impact on the colonies. Many African soldiers fought in the British Army, and the war effort disrupted colonial economies. The harsh conditions of the war, coupled with the demand for resources from the colonies, led to growing dissatisfaction. When the war ended, the African colonies began to push for political change and independence, a movement that would gain strength in the following decades. The political situation in the British colonies became even more precarious after the United States emerged from the war as a superpower. The U.S., having entered the war later, emerged victorious, while Britain's power and prestige were significantly diminished. The U.S. provided critical financial and military support during the war, and the relationship between Britain and the United States began to shift. The American leadership under President Franklin D. Roosevelt increasingly encouraged decolonization, viewing it as a way to stabilize the post-war world order. The notion of self-determination, which had been a central tenet of the wartime rhetoric, began to spread across the globe. By the end of the war in 1945, Britain was deeply in debt, and the British Empire, which had once controlled vast territories, was beginning to show signs of unraveling. The war had taken a significant toll on Britain's military and economic power. The empire, which had seemed invincible just a few decades earlier, now appeared overstretched and unable to maintain its grip on distant colonies. The first major blow to the empire came in India. The war had increased political awareness among Indians, and the promise of post-war reforms did little to quell demands for independence. The Quit India movement, led by Gandhi, began in August of 1942 as a mass non-violent campaign demanding an immediate end to British rule in India. The British response was to imprison many of India's political leaders, but the movement gained significant momentum nonetheless. After the war, with Britain exhausted and weakened, the pressure for Indian independence intensified. The Labour government elected in Britain in 1945 under Prime Minister Clement Attlee recognized that Britain could no longer maintain control over India. After years of civil disobedience and political pressure, the British agreed to the partition of India and the creation of two independent nations, India and Pakistan, in August of 1947. The partition was a momentous event, and while it marked the end of British rule, it also led to one of the most violent migrations in history, as millions of people were displaced due to religious and political divisions. The legacy of British imperialism in India, as well as the way the British handled the partition, would have lasting effects on both the region and the British Empire. The loss of India was a devastating blow to the British Empire. India had been the jewel in the crown of Britain's colonial possessions, providing wealth, resources, and strategic importance. With India's independence, Britain's empire lost its most important colony, and the collapse of the empire seemed inevitable. This loss set a pattern for other colonies to seek independence, particularly in Africa, where the push for decolonization gained momentum in the late 1940s and 50s. The period following the Second World War, from 1945 to 1960, was one of dramatic change and transformation for the British Empire. This was the age of decolonization, a process that led to the dismantling of the vast imperial system that had been built over centuries. After the war, Britain faced immense challenges, both economically and politically, that made it increasingly difficult to maintain control over its colonies. Nationalist movements, fueled by the desire for independence, began to gain momentum across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, pushing for the end of British colonial rule. The British Empire, which had once been the largest empire in history, was now on the precipice of its final collapse. The British Empire's post-war troubles began almost immediately with the economic devastation left by the war. Britain's national debt had soared during the conflict, and the country was struggling to rebuild. Its industrial base had been severely damaged, and British leadership faced the harsh reality of being unable to finance the empire. Much of the wealth that had once flowed from the colonies was now needed for domestic recovery. The economic pressures placed upon Britain created a perfect storm, where the costs of maintaining far-flung territories seemed increasingly unjustifiable, both to the British government and to its people. One of the first and most significant blows to the empire came in India, which had been Britain's most important and valuable colony. As discussed earlier, India had played a central role in the war effort, and its growing demands for independence were becoming harder to ignore. The British government, which had promised reforms during the war, found itself unable to meet these demands. By the late 1940s, the situation had reached a breaking point. The long-standing Indian independence movement, led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, finally bore fruit. After decades of peaceful protests, civil disobedience, and negotiations, India was granted independence on August 15, 1947. The partition of India, however, was a traumatic event. The country was divided along religious lines, creating two separate nations, India and Pakistan. The partition led to one of the largest migrations in history, with millions of Hindus and Muslims crossing borders to join their respective countries. The violence and upheaval that accompanied this division resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands and the displacement of millions. While India's independence marked the end of British colonial rule in South Asia, the legacy of the British Empire's partition and its effects on regional relations would persist for generations. India's independence was a watershed moment for the British Empire. The loss of India, often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the empire, symbolized the unraveling of British control over its global empire. As one of the most populous and economically important colonies, India's departure represented a significant shift in the global balance of power. It was clear that Britain could no longer maintain its imperial grip in a post-war world that was increasingly supportive of self-determination and anti-colonial movements. In the years that followed, the winds of change swept through the British Empire, and independence movements in other colonies began to gain strength. The end of British rule in India provided inspiration for other territories seeking to free themselves from colonial control. The United States, having emerged from the Second World War as a superpower, actively supported the idea of self-determination and decolonization. This was further solidified by the creation of the United Nations in 1945, which made the support of colonial independence a key part of its mission. In the Caribbean, the British Empire faced growing pressure from nationalist movements. Colonies such as Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados were increasingly demanding self-governance and greater autonomy. These demands were partly fueled by the economic challenges faced by the British Caribbean colonies, which had been heavily dependent on sugar exports. After the war, the global decline in sugar prices and the difficulty of financing colonial economies led to widespread dissatisfaction with British rule. The establishment of political parties advocating for independence and self-governance became more pronounced, and by the late 1950s, the process of granting independence to the British Caribbean began. The situation in Africa was similar. British colonies on the continent, including Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana, were also witnessing a rise in nationalist movements. These movements were inspired by the success of India and the increasing desire for independence. Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from Britain in 1957. Kwame Nkrumah, a leading figure in Ghana's independence movement, became the country's first prime minister and later its first president. Ghana's independence set a precedent for other African nations and marked the beginning of a wave of decolonization across the continent. However, not all British colonies embraced the idea of independence in the same way. In Kenya, for example, the struggle for independence was marked by violence and resistance. The Mau Mau uprising, which began in 1952, was a violent revolt against British rule, particularly by the Kikuyu people who felt marginalized by British settlers and colonial policies. The British response was brutal, with mass arrests, executions, and the imposition of a state of emergency. Despite the violence, the Mau Mau uprising ultimately led to Kenya gaining its independence in 1963. In Africa, Britain's withdrawal from its colonies was often accompanied by political and social upheaval. In many cases, the British had not established strong political institutions or allowed for effective self-rule, leaving newly independent countries to grapple with the challenges of governance and economic development. This created a volatile political climate in many former British colonies, where new leaders faced the task of uniting divided societies and overcoming the legacies of colonial exploitation. The decline of the British Empire was not limited to its former colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The empire's influence in the Middle East also began to diminish after the Second World War. Britain had long had a strategic interest in the region, particularly due to the Suez Canal and its access to oil resources. In 1956, the Suez Crisis marked a humiliating moment for Britain, when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military intervention. The military action was met with international condemnation, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union. The failure to secure the canal and the diplomatic fallout highlighted the decline of Britain's ability to project power on the world stage. The collapse of the British Empire after World War II marked the end of an era in global history. The empire, which had once stretched across the globe, was gradually dismantled as colonies gained independence in the mid-20th century. Yet, despite the formal end of British rule in most regions, the legacy of the empire continues to shape the political, economic, and cultural landscapes of former colonies, and even Britain itself. The impacts of British colonialism are deeply embedded in many post-colonial nations, influencing their systems of governance, economies, and social structures. This section explores how the legacy of the British Empire played out in the years following decolonization and how the former imperial power navigated its new place in the world. The process of decolonization, which gained momentum after World War II, was driven by a variety of factors. The economic and military costs of maintaining an empire after the war were too great for Britain to bear. At the same time, nationalist movements in the colonies, fueled by the ideals of self-determination and the growing influence of global organizations such as the United Nations, were increasingly difficult for Britain to suppress. The independence of India in 1947, followed by the decolonization of African and Caribbean territories, marked the formal end of British imperial control over much of its global possessions. Despite the end of direct rule, the influence of the British Empire persisted long after independence was achieved. In many former colonies, the institutions, political structures, and economic systems imposed during the colonial period remained in place, often with significant consequences. British-style parliamentary systems, legal frameworks, and educational systems were adopted in many of these countries, but they were not always well suited to the unique social and political landscapes of the newly independent states. One of the most visible aspects of the British Empire's legacy is the continued use of the English language. English remains the dominant or official language in many former colonies, particularly in countries like India, Nigeria, Kenya, Canada, and Australia. The widespread use of English has allowed for continued cultural, political, and economic ties between Britain and its former colonies. In some cases, English has become a unifying language in multicultural societies where various regional languages and ethnic groups coexist. For example, India, a multilingual nation with hundreds of distinct languages, uses English as a link language for governance, education, and business. Similarly, in African nations such as Kenya and Nigeria, English serves as an important means of communication in diverse societies. In addition to the linguistic legacy, the political institutions left behind by the British Empire continue to influence many former colonies. The parliamentary system, which was introduced by Britain, is still in use in countries such as Canada, India, Australia, and several Caribbean nations. While the specific forms of government vary, the basic structure of parliamentary democracy, with its system of elected representatives, a prime minister, and a constitutional monarchy in some cases, remains a common feature of post-colonial governance. This system was often seen as a symbol of modernity and stability, and its adoption was sometimes viewed as a way to secure legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. However, the legacy of British rule also left many countries with political challenges. In some former colonies, the imposition of artificial borders and the creation of centralized governance structures created political instability and internal conflict. The British Empire often drew borders with little regard for ethnic, cultural, or religious divisions, leading to tensions and violence after independence. In Africa, for example, the arbitrary division of territories during the colonial period led to ongoing disputes between ethnic groups and, in some cases, civil wars. Nigeria, with its diverse ethnic groups, has experienced decades of political unrest and civil conflict since gaining independence in 1960. The economic legacy of the British Empire is another area where the effects of colonialism are still felt. British colonial policies were often geared toward extracting resources from colonies to benefit the British economy. Many colonies were used as sources of raw materials such as cotton, sugar, and rubber, which were then exported to Britain for processing and manufacturing. The structure of colonial economies was based on the extraction and export of these resources, often with little regard for the development of local industries or infrastructure. When the colonies gained independence, many were left with economies that were heavily reliant on the export of a few commodities, making them vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets. In the years following independence, many former colonies struggled with economic development. While some countries were able to diversify their economies and build stronger industries, others continued to face economic challenges. For instance, in the Caribbean, many nations remained dependent on the production of sugar and other agricultural exports, making them susceptible to changes in commodity prices. Similarly, in parts of Africa, former colonies struggled to develop their own industries, as colonial economies had been designed to serve the interests of the British Empire, not the local populations. The British Empire also left a lasting imprint on the educational systems of many former colonies. In countries such as India, Kenya, and South Africa, the British established schools and universities that were modeled on the British education system. While this system helped create a class of educated elites who were able to contribute to the development of their countries after independence, it also left many countries with educational structures that were not always responsive to local needs. In some cases, the British education system promoted values that were disconnected from indigenous cultures and traditions, leading to tensions over the role of education in post-colonial societies. Culturally, the British Empire's influence continued to shape the identity of many former colonies. The spread of British culture, literature, and values had a profound effect on the societies it controlled. British literature, philosophy, and the English language itself became central to education and intellectual life in many colonies. However, the legacy of British cultural dominance was often contested. In India, for example, leaders like Gandhi and Nehru promoted a vision of a modern nation that was rooted in Indian traditions, while simultaneously engaging with the Western world. The post-colonial period saw a revival of indigenous cultures and a re-evaluation of British cultural values, but many of the cultural foundations laid by the British Empire continued to influence politics, education, and social life. The final stages of British decolonization, which unfolded between the mid-20th century and the early 1970s, were marked by the disintegration of the British Empire as many of its colonies gained independence. This period was shaped by the global transformation that took place after the Second World War, as newly empowered nations sought autonomy, and the idea of self-determination gained widespread momentum. These events profoundly reshaped global politics, the international economy, and Britain's role in the world. By the end of the 1960s, the once mighty British Empire had effectively dissolved, replaced by a new political entity, the Commonwealth. Following the end of the Second World War, Britain found itself in a state of decline, politically, economically, and militarily. The costs of the war, compounded by the destruction of British infrastructure, left the country heavily indebted. The empire, which had been central to British power, was increasingly difficult to maintain, especially in the face of growing nationalist movements and demands for independence in the colonies. In the immediate aftermath of the war, it became clear that Britain could no longer afford to cling to its far-reaching imperial network, which spanned continents and included territories in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. The first significant shift in British colonial policy occurred with the independence of India in 1947, an event that had far-reaching consequences not only for Britain but for the entire British Empire. India's independence marked the beginning of a broader wave of decolonization that would sweep across Asia and Africa in the coming decades. The British withdrawal from India set a precedent for other colonies to demand self-rule, and it was a stark recognition of the changing balance of power in the world. As India gained independence, it was divided into two nations, India and Pakistan, which created significant upheaval and led to one of the largest migrations in history. The partition of India not only altered the political landscape of South Asia, but also became a symbol of the British Empire's inability to manage its vast colonial holdings. In the years following India's independence, Britain's other colonies began to follow suit. The process of decolonization was not smooth and often involved violent struggles, political unrest, and challenges to British authority. For instance, in Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising, which had started in the early 1950s, played a pivotal role in bringing about independence in 1963. The British had brutally suppressed the rebellion, but the struggle for self-rule continued to gather momentum, culminating in the eventual establishment of an independent Kenya. Similarly, in Egypt, British control had been increasingly contested in the years following the war. In 1952, a military coup led by General Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the Egyptian monarchy and established a republic. Nasser sought to modernize Egypt and remove British influence, particularly over the Suez Canal, which was vital for British trade routes and colonial interests. The Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain, along with France and Israel, attempted to invade Egypt after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, marked a humiliating defeat for Britain. The international community, including the United States and the Soviet Union, condemned the invasion, and Britain was forced to withdraw. This crisis highlighted the erosion of British power and signaled the end of its control over Egypt, which gained full independence later that year. In Africa, the process of decolonization continued as Britain relinquished control of its colonies. In Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah led the movement for independence, which was achieved in 1957. Ghana's independence was a landmark event, as it became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from colonial rule. Ghana's success served as an inspiration for other African nations, and the momentum for independence in Africa grew throughout the 1950s and 60s. Many other African colonies, including Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda, followed suit, achieving independence from Britain in the years that followed. However, decolonization in Africa was not without its challenges. The process often led to internal divisions, as ethnic and political groups, many of which had been artificially united under colonial rule, struggled to coexist. In Nigeria, for example, the newly independent country faced significant ethnic tensions that led to civil strife and a brutal civil war, known as the Biafran War, which lasted from 1967 to 1970. In Kenya, the post-independence period was also marked by political instability, as the country struggled to establish a stable government after gaining independence in 1963. As Britain relinquished control over its colonies, a new form of association emerged, the Commonwealth of Nations. The Commonwealth was established as a voluntary association of former colonies, independent countries, and territories that had once been part of the British Empire. This organization was meant to reflect the shared values and cooperation between Britain and its former colonies in a post-imperial world. The Commonwealth allowed Britain to maintain political, economic, and cultural ties with its former colonies, even after their independence. The Commonwealth was also seen as a way to manage the transition from empire to a new international order. It was a way to preserve Britain's influence on the world stage and ensure that its relationships with former colonies remained strong, despite the end of direct colonial rule. Over time, the Commonwealth evolved to include a diverse range of countries, many of which had gained independence after World War II. Some members, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, had already achieved self-governance and continued to maintain close ties with Britain. Others, like India and Pakistan, had established their own independent paths but chose to remain part of the Commonwealth for diplomatic and cultural reasons. However, the Commonwealth was not without its challenges. The diversity of its membership, encompassing countries from all continents, meant that there were significant differences in political systems, economic development, and social issues. Tensions occasionally arose, especially as former colonies in Africa and the Caribbean gained independence and sought to distance themselves from Britain's influence. Furthermore, the Commonwealth was a reflection of the evolving natabodity, where the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the dominant superpowers, and Britain's influence was increasingly limited to the Commonwealth and its former colonies. The post-colonial period also brought with it a series of important challenges for Britain. As a former colonial power, Britain struggled to redefine its role in a rapidly changing world. The loss of empire, combined with the declining economic power of the country, meant that Britain could no longer wield the same global influence it once had. The dissolution of the British Empire led to a rethinking of British identity, both in terms of its relationship with its former colonies and its place in the international community. In the years following decolonization, Britain began to turn inward, grappling with its economic problems and political challenges. The decline of manufacturing, rising unemployment, and inflation contributed to social unrest. In the early 1970s, Britain experienced industrial strikes and political instability as the country struggled to adapt to a world where its imperial past was no longer relevant. At the same time, immigration from former colonies brought new cultural diversity to Britain, leading to both opportunities and tensions in British society. Following the dramatic decolonization processes of the mid-20th century, the British Empire, once the largest and most powerful empire in world history, officially began its dissolution. While the British Empire's territorial expanse was reduced significantly by the late 1960s, its legacy did not vanish overnight. Instead, the influence of the empire continued to be felt both in Britain and across its former colonies. In place of the imperial system, the British Commonwealth of Nations emerged as a new structure designed to maintain ties between Britain and its former colonies, many of which had gained independence. Yet, the legacy of the empire and the challenges that came with post-colonial relationships have endured into the modern era. This section explores the evolution of these relationships, the continuing impact of British colonial rule, and the complex legacies of both the Commonwealth and post-colonial identity. The establishment of the Commonwealth after World War II was a crucial development in Britain's transition from empire to post-colonial state. The Commonwealth, initially a voluntary association of former colonies and territories, provided a framework through which Britain could maintain cultural, economic, and political links with its former empire. Unlike the formal empire, which was based on direct control and governance, the Commonwealth was based on cooperation, mutual respect, and voluntary association. The Commonwealth of Nations evolved into a diverse international body, representing a wide range of countries with different political systems, economies, and cultures. Some member states, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were already self-governing and had close historical ties to Britain, with parliamentary systems based on the British model. These countries remained close allies of Britain, often participating in joint military endeavors and economic partnerships. For other former colonies, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, the Commonwealth became an avenue for diplomatic cooperation and mutual support as they navigated their post-independence challenges. While the Commonwealth served as an avenue for continued collaboration, it was not a straightforward or uncontroversial arrangement. The fact that the Commonwealth consisted of nations that were once under British rule meant that, for many countries, membership was a reminder of colonial oppression. The economic, social, and political structures that Britain had imposed on its colonies had lasting impacts on the development of these nations. In many cases, the post-independence struggles of these countries were tied to the challenges of undoing the legacy of colonialism. A significant aspect of the legacy of British colonial rule was the enduring influence of the English language. English has remained the primary or secondary language in many Commonwealth countries, often serving as the language of government, education, business, and international diplomacy. This linguistic connection has allowed for continued cultural exchange and cooperation within the Commonwealth, but has also led to complex issues of identity and self-determination. In many countries, the dominance of English has sometimes been seen as a continuation of the colonial influence, overshadowing indigenous languages and cultures. The persistence of English as the global lingua franca, while beneficial for communication and commerce, often brings with it challenges related to cultural assimilation and the preservation of local traditions. The British legal and political systems also left a lasting imprint on many Commonwealth countries. The parliamentary model, with its focus on representative democracy, the rule of law, and individual rights, has been widely adopted. However, the implementation of these systems was not always smooth, as the local political dynamics in former colonies did not always align with the British system. In many cases, newly independent nations had to adapt the British model to suit their own political and cultural realities. The process of building democratic institutions, resolving ethnic or regional tensions, and establishing stable governance systems was complicated by the colonial legacy of legacies of power structures and a lack of political autonomy. One of the most striking examples of this ongoing relationship between Britain and its former colonies is the complex history of migration patterns from the former empire to Britain. Following World War II, Britain faced significant labor shortages and, in response, encouraged migration from the Commonwealth. Thousands of individuals from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Africa moved to Britain to fill jobs in factories, transport, and public services. The most notable wave of immigration occurred between the late 1940s and the 1970s, with communities such as the Windrush generation from the Caribbean becoming an integral part of British society. However, the migration of former colonial subjects to Britain also brought challenges. The arrival of large numbers of immigrants sparked racial tensions, and many immigrants faced discrimination, marginalization, and a lack of social acceptance. These racial tensions were often exacerbated by the fact that Britain was still grappling with its imperial identity and its changing role in the world. Immigrants who had fought for Britain during the war and contributed to the country's post-war recovery found that they were often treated as second-class citizens. The experience of post-colonial migration shaped the social and political landscape of Britain, leading to debates over multiculturalism, integration, and national identity. In addition to migration, the post-colonial world saw the development of political and economic relationships between Britain and its former colonies. While the Commonwealth offered a diplomatic framework, the economic ties between Britain and many of its former colonies were still deeply intertwined. Trade, investment, and aid were key components of Britain's ongoing relationship with the Commonwealth. However, these relationships were often shaped by the economic realities of the post-war world, with many former colonies struggling with poverty, underdevelopment, and political instability. In many cases, Britain's ability to offer financial support was limited by its own economic struggles in the aftermath of the war. In Africa, for example, Britain's former colonies continued to face significant challenges in the post-colonial period. The borders that were drawn by the British during the colonial period often exacerbated ethnic and political divisions, leading to civil wars, military coups, and widespread instability. In countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, and Sudan, ethnic rivalries that had been suppressed during British rule resurfaced, complicating efforts to build national unity. British involvement in the post-independence period was often limited, as Britain's own resources were stretched thin and the British government was reluctant to become embroiled in the internal affairs of its former colonies. Similarly, in the Caribbean, former British colonies like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago faced economic challenges as they transitioned from being reliant on sugar and other agricultural exports to trying to diversify their economies. The shift from a colonial economy built around monocultures and the exploitation of resources to one of self-sufficiency and development posed significant hurdles. British investment, trade, and aid played a crucial role in the economic development of these countries, but many Caribbean nations found that they still faced considerable obstacles in building a fully independent and prosperous future. In South Asia, the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan in 1947 left a profound and complex legacy. While India emerged as the world's largest democracy and a rising global power, Pakistan's political instability, military coups, and struggles with its ethnic and religious minorities led to long-term challenges. In addition, the region's ongoing conflicts, particularly over Kashmir, were largely the result of British-imposed borders that didn't take into account the region's ethnic and religious diversity. The ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan, as well as the issue of India's relationship with its neighbors, remain central to the geopolitical dynamics of South Asia today. One of the enduring questions in post-colonial relations is the role of Britain in the modern world. While the country no longer controls a vast empire, its political and economic influence remains significant. The legacy of the British Empire has led to deep ties between Britain and many of its former colonies, but these relationships are no longer defined by dominance or control. Instead, they are marked by a more equal exchange of ideas, trade, and culture. As the 20th century unfolded and the British Empire faded into history, both Britain and its former colonies faced profound challenges in redefining their roles in the world. The post-empire era brought new questions of national identity, economic development, and global diplomacy. While Britain no longer held the vast territorial expanse of the empire, its history, culture, and political influence continued to shape its position on the world stage. For its former colonies, the task of building stable, independent nations while grappling with the legacy of colonialism was no less complex. This section examines how both Britain and its former colonies navigated the shifting sands of post-imperial identity, economic struggles, and changing global dynamics in the latter half of the 20th century. For Britain, the question of national identity in the post-imperial era was fraught with complexities. Once the ruler of a vast empire, Britain now found itself confronted with the reality of a diminished global role. The loss of its colonies marked not just a political and economic shift, but a cultural and psychological one. The British people had long defined their sense of national pride through the lens of empire. The grandeur and legacy of the British Empire had been intertwined with British identity. With the dissolution of the empire, many Britons had to come to terms with their country's new role in the world. Britain could no longer rely on imperial power to project influence or maintain its place as a dominant global player. This challenge was reflected in the national discourse in Britain. The question of how to navigate post-empire identity was complicated by a sense of nostalgia for Britain's imperial past, which often clashed with the realities of modern, global politics. As Britain transitioned from being the center of a vast empire to a more modest world power, it grappled with the loss of its global status. The sense of imperial pride persisted among some sections of society, but it also gave way to a more introspective and uncertain view of national identity. This period of adjustment coincided with a wave of immigration to Britain from former colonies, particularly from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, and Africa. This migration brought new cultural influences and transformed the social fabric of Britain. As former colonies became independent, many citizens from these nations moved to Britain to seek better opportunities and contribute to the rebuilding of a post-war society. The arrival of these new communities, however, sparked racial tensions, and issues surrounding immigration, integration, and identity became a point of contention in British politics and society. The Windrush generation, for example, refers to the large number of Caribbean immigrants who arrived in Britain between 1948 and 1951, many of them invited to help rebuild the country after the devastation of the Second World War. While their contributions were vital, the reception they received was often less than welcoming, as racial prejudice and discrimination persisted. The experience of racial inequality among the immigrant communities played a significant role in the formation of the new multicultural identity in Britain. The struggle for equal rights led to major social and political movements in the 1950s and 60s, culminating in the Race Relations Act of 1965, which made racial discrimination illegal in public places. The national identity of Britain thus became a more complex and diverse concept in the second half of the 20th century. The legacy of colonialism, coupled with the experiences of immigration and social change, reshaped British society. The challenge of integrating different cultural influences into a coherent national identity remains a defining issue in contemporary British politics and culture. The question of Britain's post-imperial identity continues to influence debates about national unity, citizenship, and the place of immigrants in British society. For many former colonies, achieving economic stability and growth after independence was no small feat. Colonial economies had been structured to serve the interests of the British Empire, often focusing on the extraction of raw materials and the cultivation of cash crops. These economies were highly dependent on British trade and markets, and the post-independence era left many countries with weak industrial bases and fragile economic systems. The challenge of transitioning from a colonial economy to one that could support an independent, self-sustaining nation was immense. In Africa, for example, many newly independent countries struggled to diversify their economies and create industries that could provide jobs and build a strong economic foundation. The British had typically maintained control over key industries, such as mining and agriculture, and had not encouraged the development of local industries. As a result, many post-colonial African economies remained heavily dependent on agriculture and raw material exports. In countries such as Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya, the lack of infrastructure and limited access to global markets made it difficult to sustain economic growth. In Asia, India, which was once Britain's most important colony, faced its own set of economic challenges. India's economy was largely agrarian, and it relied heavily on British-established industries, many of which were focused on exporting raw materials. After independence, India had to develop its own industries, infrastructure, and agricultural policies. The government, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, pursued a policy of industrialization and state-led development, focusing on sectors such as steel, coal, and textiles. While India made significant strides in industrial growth, it still faced significant challenges such as poverty, unemployment, and regional disparities. The British Empire had also left behind a legacy of economic disparity in many of its former colonies. The wealth created through imperialism was often concentrated in the hands of a small elite, with the vast majority of the population living in poverty. The task of addressing this inequality after independence was daunting, and many former colonies struggled to establish systems of governance that could distribute resources fairly and equitably. In some cases, the legacies of colonialism, such as land distribution policies, educational systems, and political structures, created further divisions and challenges for post-colonial governments. For Britain, the economic consequences of empire were also significant. While the British economy remained relatively strong after World War II, the loss of colonies and the decline of imperial trade networks led to a shift in Britain's economic relationships. The British economy became more reliant on international trade and financial services rather than raw materials and manufacturing. In the decades following the end of the empire, Britain also faced the challenge of adapting to a global economy in which the United States and Japan were emerging as dominant industrial powers. The British government responded by increasingly seeking integration with Europe, culminating in Britain's decision to join the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1973. As Britain's imperial power waned, its role in global diplomacy evolved. The British Empire had once been a central player in international politics, but after the end of World War II, Britain found itself in a world dominated by the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, though still influential, was no longer the dominant global power it had once been. The collapse of the empire meant that Britain needed to adjust to a new international order. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 was a key development in this new global structure. The United Nations was designed to promote peace and cooperation among nations and to provide a forum for resolving international disputes. Britain, as one of the founding members of the UN and a permanent member of the Security Council, continued to have a voice in global diplomacy, but its influence was now balanced by the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union. In the post-imperial world, Britain also increasingly focused on building relationships with its former colonies. The Commonwealth, as mentioned earlier, became a key mechanism for maintaining ties between Britain and its former colonies. The relationship between Britain and the Commonwealth countries was one of mutual cooperation, but it was also marked by the complexity of post-colonial identities and the shifting dynamics of power. The Commonwealth allowed for continued diplomatic engagement, but it also signaled the end of Britain's imperial dominance. As the world moved toward the end of the 20th century, Britain's role in global diplomacy continued to evolve. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s marked another shift in global geopolitics, and Britain found itself navigating a new world order. Throughout this period, Britain's influence continued to be significant, but it was shaped by new challenges, including the rise of regional powers, the global economy, and the increasing importance of international cooperation. As the world moved into the late 20th century and into the 21st, the legacies of the British Empire continued to shape both the United Kingdom and its former colonies. The post-imperial era, while marked by profound political, economic, and social change, has also been defined by ongoing struggles and opportunities for collaboration in a highly interconnected and rapidly changing world. This section explores the contemporary challenges that both Britain and its former colonies face, particularly in relation to political and economic inequality, global conflicts, and the future of post-imperial relations. One of the most enduring consequences of British colonialism has been the complex process of establishing stable political systems in many former colonies. Although many countries gained independence in the mid-20th century, the legacies of colonial rule, particularly the artificial borders drawn by imperial powers, the lack of infrastructure for self-rule, and the imposition of foreign political systems, continued to affect post-independence governance. National identity in these countries has often been fraught with tensions as newly formed nations grapple with the remnants of colonial rule. In Africa, the post-independence era was often marked by political instability and ethnic conflict. The British Empire, like other European powers, had drawn borders that ignored ethnic, cultural, and religious divisions, leading to tensions in many African states after independence. In some countries, these divisions fueled civil wars, military coups, and instability. In Nigeria, for instance, the ethnic divisions between the Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo groups led to decades of political unrest and the Biafran War, which caused significant loss of life and damage to the nation. Similarly, in Kenya, the legacy of British colonial rule and the displacement of indigenous populations by European settlers continued to affect land ownership and political power long after independence. In India, while the independence movement led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru achieved its goal of self-rule in 1947, the partition of India created a new set of challenges. The partition of India into India and Pakistan, based on religious divisions, led to one of the largest mass migrations in history, accompanied by widespread violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. The legacy of partition continues to shape Indo-Pakistani relations today, particularly over the Kashmir region, which remains a contentious issue between the two nations. For many former colonies, the question of national identity has remained a significant issue in the post-imperial era. While independence allowed these countries to reclaim sovereignty, the cultural and political ties to Britain often persisted, and in some cases, post-colonial nations struggled to form coherent identities that integrated both indigenous cultures and the Western institutions inherited from colonial rule. Efforts to build inclusive, multi-ethnic national identities have often clashed with deep-seated historical divisions, leading to political instability, social unrest, and challenges to the legitimacy of post-colonial governments. The economic legacies of British colonialism have been among the most significant challenges facing former colonies in the post-imperial period. Colonial rule had a profound impact on the economic structures of many countries, with economies being structured primarily around the extraction of raw materials and the production of agricultural goods for export to Britain. The British Empire often stifled the development of local industries and infrastructures, focusing instead on resource extraction and trade relationships that benefited the empire. After independence, many former colonies struggled to build strong, diversified economies that could support their growing populations and provide for their citizens' needs. In many cases, the economic structures left behind by Britain were poorly suited to the realities of independent nationhood. Countries that had been reliant on the export of a few commodities, such as sugar, cocoa, tea, or cotton, found themselves vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets. This lack of economic diversification made it difficult for many countries to achieve sustained economic growth and development in the post-colonial period. Additionally, the economic disparities created during the colonial era, where wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, left many newly independent countries struggling with inequality. Land reforms were slow to take place in many regions, and colonial elites who had been aligned with the British authorities often retained their wealth and power after independence, exacerbating social divisions and economic instability. In the Caribbean, former British colonies such as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago continued to depend heavily on sugar production even after independence. While these nations sought to diversify their economies, they faced immense challenges due to their reliance on foreign markets and the economic legacy of plantation economies. Similarly, in many parts of Africa, the lack of infrastructure and a skilled labor force hindered efforts at industrialization and economic growth. Despite the potential for economic success, the persistence of neo-colonial economic relationships in which former imperial powers continued to exert influence over trade and investment meant that many former colonies struggled to achieve true economic independence. The legacy of imperial economic policies continues to impact global trade today. Former British colonies, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, often found themselves on the periphery of the global economy. Britain, in turn, struggled with its post-imperial economic role, trying to transition from an empire-based economy to one focused on global trade and finance. The Commonwealth, while providing a diplomatic framework for cooperation, couldn't fully overcome the economic disparities that had been entrenched during the colonial period. As the 20th century progressed, the role of former colonial powers like Britain in global diplomacy evolved. No longer an empire controlling vast territories, Britain's role in the world was redefined in the context of a bipolar global order during the Cold War. Britain became a key member of NATO, and its foreign policy was increasingly aligned with the United States, its primary ally in the Western Bloc. However, the continued presence of the British military in former colonies, such as in Cyprus and Hong Kong, reflected the lingering impact of imperialism in British foreign policy. Moreover, Britain's membership in international organizations such as the United Nations, the European Union, and the Commonwealth allowed it to maintain diplomatic relationships with its former colonies, although often on terms of greater equality and cooperation. However, Britain's loss of empire was still keenly felt in its global position, and as global conflicts evolved, Britain struggled to balance its traditional diplomatic roles with the changing dynamics of international power. The Vietnam War and the Korean War, as well as conflicts in the Middle East and Africa, required Britain to engage with former colonies in new diplomatic and military contexts. The post-colonial relationship, however, was often marked by a tension between Britain's historical influence and the new reality of emerging superpowers. During these conflicts, the actions and policies of former colonial powers were often scrutinized for their imperial history, as Britain had previously played significant roles in shaping these regions during its colonial rule. The British role in the Middle East provides a good example of post-colonial diplomatic challenges. Britain's involvement in the region began long before its empire's decline. Following the decline of British imperial power, the Middle East remained a region of geopolitical importance, largely due to oil resources and strategic location. British foreign policy was still strongly tied to the legacy of the empire, particularly in its relations with former colonies like Egypt and Iraq. However, as new nations in the Middle East gained independence, their relations with Britain were often defined by complex legacies of imperialism, and Britain's diplomatic influence was diminished. In Africa, where most former colonies had gained independence by the early 1960s, Britain's diplomatic relations were similarly marked by ongoing challenges. Despite efforts to foster ties through the Commonwealth, the legacy of British colonial rule sometimes impeded cooperation and trust. Countries such as Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria faced the challenges of rethinking their identities and political systems while managing their complex histories with Wwii. As we enter the 21st century, the post-colonial world continues to face challenges and opportunities. Former British colonies have made significant progress in many areas, but the legacy of the British Empire remains deeply embedded in both the political and economic systems of many countries. The struggle for equality, self-determination, and economic development continues to shape post-colonial societies. For Britain, the challenge lies in reconciling its imperial past with its present-day role in a globalized world. The British identity has become increasingly multicultural, and the legacy of empire is now viewed in complex ways. Britain's post-imperial diplomacy continues to evolve, balancing relationships within the Commonwealth with its new relationships with emerging powers such as China and India. In the wake of Brexit, Britain's role in Europe has also shifted dramatically, with the country attempting to redefine its global position outside the European Union.